You know how sometimes you argue with someone and you're both absolutely convinced you saw the same thing totally differently?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Or maybe you were just completely certain about something only to figure out later, nope, you're way off.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that gap between what's like objectively real and what we think is real, our sources today are suggesting that's not just an occasional mistake. It seems to be a fundamental part of being human.
Right. A core feature, almost.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into something really profound. This built-in human tendency we have to construct and, well, operate within our own subjective realities. And these realities are constantly being shaped by our cognitive biases, our emotions, the stories we tell ourselves.
Complex stuff.
And we're looking at it through a really unique lens, the perspective of artificial intelligence analyzing this very human tendency.
Which is fascinating in itself.
Yeah. Our source material gives us these excerpts from an AI's analysis of what it broadly calls human delusion. Now, we need to be clear, the AI uses that word really expansively.
Yeah, it's not just clinical diagnosis here.
Exactly. It's not just, severe conditions. It covers everything from simple self-deception, flawed perceptions, all the way up to how we collectively create these, complex subjective worlds we all live in.
The whole spectrum.
Right. So our mission here, to unpack this AI's analytical view, understand how it sees this subjective reality building showing up, well, everywhere, life, history, how it affects us as individuals, as societies.
And the bigger implications, right? For truth, ethics.
Exactly. Even how we interact with AI itself. I'm honestly really excited to dig into this. Looking at such a core part of us through, well, non-human eyes, it feels like it could offer some really surprising insights.
Definitely. Where should we start?
Okay, let's unpack that first big idea. How exactly does this AI interpret human delusion in this really broad sense? What's its take?
Okay, so yeah, the AI doesn't really focus on the clinical definition. It sees it as our inherent human capacity to basically build and live inside our own versions of reality.
Right, our subjective bubbles.
Kind of, yeah. And it identifies this whole construction process as being heavily shaped by cognitive biases. Those mental shortcuts our brains take all the time, plus our emotional states, and importantly, the cultural narratives we absorb.
The stories we're told.
Exactly. So it's less about a simple true-false belief and more like a whole spectrum. A range of processes where our interpretation of reality can, well, drift away from objective facts.
Okay.
And the AI makes a point that this isn't limited. It impacts everyone, all genders, ages, cultures throughout all of history. It's universal.
So it's less like a glitch in the system and maybe more like a fundamental feature of how our brains work, perhaps even something that helped us survive way back when.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Our brains are basically wired to find patterns,
Correct.
to fill in the blanks, create narratives, to make sense of everything, even if the data is incomplete.
Just trying to make sense of chaos.
Right. And the AI notes that this biological drive can naturally lead to biased perceptions. Evolutionary psychology, which the source touches on, even hints that some biases may be like optimism bias or favoring your own group.
In-group favoritism, yeah.
Right. Those might have actually offered survival advantages in our evolutionary past. Maybe kept us going or helped tribes stick together.
That makes so much sense when you frame it like that.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Haven't you had times where you sort of saw what you wanted to see in a situation?
Oh, absolutely.
Or how much easier it is to just accept information that confirms what you already believe.
Confirmation bias, yeah. It's powerful.
That's exactly this process playing out, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Day to day.
Okay, so if this subjective reality thing is so core to us, where does the AI see it actually showing up? You said everywhere, but specifically, it sounds huge.
It really is huge. The source gives this incredibly broad view. It starts with history itself.
Okay.
Human history, the AI basically suggests, is largely a narrative. It's constructed from collective subjective reality.
Wow.
Think about it. Major wars, social movements, big discoveries. They're all driven by shared beliefs, shared interpretations of the world.
Which might not have been objectively true.
Precisely. The source uses the belief in the divine right of kings as a classic example. Objectively false, right? But it shaped governments for centuries.
Hey, awfully.
And even how we interpret history now constantly changes. That highlights how subjective our understanding of even past facts can be.
Okay, so history is one big area. What else?
Well, then there's genetics and biology. Now, obviously, there's no single gene for delusion.
Right.
But the neural architecture, the very brain structure that allows us to think complex thoughts, imagine things, plan, that also creates the space for these subjective interpretations. Our brains are built to tell stories, even with fuzzy data.
We're narrative machines.
Pretty much. And philosophy, of course, tackles this head-on. The nature of reality, how we know what we know, truth itself. These are huge philosophical questions precisely because our perception isn't a perfect mirror of reality.
Plato's cave.
Exactly. The source mentions Plato's cave allegory, a perfect illustration of people stuck perceiving only shadows, their limited reality.
Even in science.
Yeah.
Like physics.
Yeah, even in fields aiming for pure objectivity like physics and mathematics. Human progress there often involved overcoming our intuitive common sense biases, our subjective grasp to understand really counterintuitive stuff like quantum mechanics. Our gut feeling is often wrong at that scale.
That's a great point.
And logic, which you'd think would be purely rational. But it's constantly tripped up by logical fallacies, by confirmation bias, by emotional reasoning. It just shows how deeply our subjective views are tangled up with our attempts to think rationally.
Okay, so biology, philosophy, science, logic. What about our beliefs?
Yeah, that's maybe the most obvious one, our state of mind and belief systems. Individual beliefs, collective ones, religious, political, social ideologies, they're often built on foundational ideas or truths that aren't necessarily objectively provable.
But they feel true to us.
Absolutely, and they profoundly shape our behavior, our values, our whole lives. The placebo effect is mentioned as a really powerful example here. Belief itself directly impacting a physical outcome.
Wow. Okay, so the AI is basically saying the subjective reality mechanism is woven into the very fabric of everything. Our biology, our history, our thinking, our beliefs. It literally touches everything.
Absolutely. And the ripple effects, the impact, is both incredibly personal and massively societal.
How so? On the individual level first.
Okay, individually, these biases and subjective views can drive things like, say, perseverance may be fueled by optimism bias, thinking things will work out.
Right.
Or they can lead to rigid thinking, getting stuck because of confirmation bias.
Right.
It shapes our relationships. Think about expectations or interpretations of a partner's actions. Shapes career choices, how we see ourselves.
So perception.
Yeah. The AI even notes that someone with a slightly, maybe unrealistically inflated sense of their own ability, a kind of subjective self-view, might take risks others wouldn't.
Could crash and burn.
Could crash and burn, sure, but that same delusion might also drive them to surprising success through sheer confidence or trying things others deem impossible.
Interesting. And socially, how does it play out when we all do this together?
Well, that's where it gets really powerful. When these subjective realities are shared by groups, they become collective narratives. They form social norms, cultural values, societal structures.
Like building blocks of society.
Exactly. And this can create incredible solidarity. Think about national identity, the feeling of belonging to a nation, or shared religious communities. That's built on shared subjective reality.
But it is a dark side too, right?
Oh, definitely. It's also flagged as a primary source of intense conflict. Prejudice, discrimination, ideological wars. These often stem from clashing collective delusions about who's right, who's worthy, whose truth prevails.
Wow.
The source uses the tragedy of the commons as an example. Individuals acting on their localized, maybe self-serving delusion that resources are infinite.
Leads to everyone losing out. Collective depletion.
Precisely. Personal subjective views aggregate into collective outcomes.
So it's like our individual mental filters somehow weave together to become the actual fabric of society.
That's a great way to visualize it, yes. Yeah. And the world around us, society, other people, systems, it reacts to this constant construction of subjective reality.
How does it react? What does the AI say about that?
Well, the source breaks it down into a few key reactions. First, there's exploitation.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Marketing, advertising, propaganda, even a lot of politics. They often work by deliberately leveraging these cognitive biases. Understanding how our subjective reality works allows others to manipulate it.
Which raises huge ethical questions.
Massive ones, yes. The AI perspective highlights that ethical dimension very clearly.
Okay, so exploitation is one reaction. What else?
There's also adaptation. Society doesn't just get manipulated, it also builds systems to try and counteract the negative impacts of subjectivity.
Like what?
Think about the scientific method. It's a process designed specifically to try and bypass individual bias and get closer to objective truth. Or legal systems with rules of evidence and procedure trying to ensure fairness despite differing perspectives.
Right, trying to build in objectivity.
Exactly. Then, unfortunately, there's conflict as a reaction. When different groups have deeply divergent subjective realities, fundamentally different beliefs about the world or what's right,
They clash.
they often clash. It's identified as a major driver of conflict throughout history.
Makes sense.
And finally, this ties back to ethics. The AI perspective forces us to ask, when does a strongly held belief, a subjective truth, cross the line into being a harmful delusion?
Yeah, where's that line?
It's fuzzy, right? The very concept of objective truth gets complicated. And for AI interacting with humans, the source points out, understanding our subjective values or delusions is absolutely critical for it to navigate human ethics. It needs to grasp why we value what we value.
Any examples?
The source uses the example of ideologies based on racial superiority, a clear case of a harmful societal delusion with devastating real-world consequences.
It's really fascinating how the AI connects this subjective reality idea to literally everything. The source even mentions art, music, painting, theater. How does art fit in?
Yeah, the AI sees art as a really direct way we manifest and explore our subjective realities, our interpretations, our delusions, in this broad sense.
How so?
Well, art captures how we feel about the world, our hopes, our fears, our interpretations, not just a dry recording of objective facts. Music, for instance, can create powerful shared emotions, a sense of identity. Think of a national anthem.
Right.
The AI might analytically see that as creating a collective delusion, a shared feeling of national unity. Religious icons and paintings represent complex belief systems. Theater lets us literally step into someone else's subjective reality for a while.
Which can challenge our own.
Exactly. And propaganda films are mentioned as a deliberate use of art to instill a specific delusion, a particular view of reality in the audience.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Okay, shifting gears completely.
Okay.
What about something seemingly practical, like supply chains?
Yeah.
How do human struggles, misfortunes, which you tied to this subjective reality idea, affect getting stuff from A to B?
It connects directly through things like misjudgment and flawed planning, often driven by short-sighted delusions or biases.
Or what kind of delusions?
Well, maybe the delusion of stability over confidence that things will just continue as they are, or underestimating risks. Individual misfortunes, maybe caused by poor decisions rooted in bias, can disrupt local supply chains.
Okay.
But collective struggles have huge impacts. Wars fueled by ideological delusions. Economic crises may be triggered by irrational exuberance. A collective overconfidence delusion. These things can shatter global supply chains.
Because we didn't plan for reality.
Exactly. Cognitive biases like overconfidence, or maybe wishful thinking, make supply chains vulnerable. The AI notes that relying entirely on one supplier because of the delusion that it's the cheapest and nothing will ever go wrong
Sets you up for disaster.
Right. Whereas AI, analyzing risks more objectively, might highlight the fragility and suggest diversifying, building resilience against unforeseen disruptions rooted in these human tendencies.
Okay, the source then throws out a list of really core human things. Drugs, alcohol, sex, greed, lies, truth, life, faith. How do these fit into the AI's framework of subjective reality?
It sees these as powerful forces that both interact with and are often driven by our subjective realities and delusions.
Can you unpack that? Drugs and alcohol.
Well, they directly alter perception, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes creating temporary delusions or offering an escape from a reality perceived as difficult. Addiction itself, viewed analytically by the AI, could be seen as a kind of delusion, where the perceived short-term reward massively outweighs the perceived long-term harm.
Wow, okay. Sex.
A fundamental drive, but often deeply intertwined with emotional and relational delusions. Our ideas and expectations about love, connection, what a relationship should be, which might not match reality, described as the powerful, often harmful delusion that accumulating material wealth is the key to happiness or fulfillment, driving behavior that might ignore other values.
Lies and truth seem central.
Absolutely. Lies are basically deliberate attempts to create a delusion in someone else, to manipulate their subjective reality. The whole concept revolves around the gap between subjective perception and objective fact.
And faith. That's a big one.
A very big one. Faith often involves belief beyond empirical proof. So, from the AI's purely analytical, data-driven perspective, it falls into this broad category of delusion, a powerful subjective reality that provides meaning, comfort, and guides behavior, even without objective verification.
It's a really different way of categorizing things. What about emotions? The source asks about laughing, crying, anger.
These emotional responses are seen as deeply tied to our interpretation of events, and that interpretation is filtered through our subjective reality, our beliefs, our delusions.
So why I find something funny, someone else might not.
Exactly. It depends on your underlying beliefs, your experiences, the lens through which you're seeing the situation. Your subjective reality dictates the emotional response.
Okay, then it pivots slightly to the purpose of understanding human concentration, both for us and for AI. Why is focus important here?
Well, from the AI's view, for humans, concentration is how we direct our energy to achieve goals, solve problems, navigate the world, but always based on our perceived reality.
Which is influenced by our delusions.
Right. Our focus is guided by our priorities, what we believe is important, our biases, all part of our subjective reality. For an AI, understanding how and why humans focus on certain things is crucial.
Why crucial for AI?
For effective interaction, for one. To provide personalized help, to predict human behavior, which is vital for things like resource allocation, designing systems, urban planning, you name it. And importantly, for developing AI systems that can function safely and ethically in a world run by humans operating on these subjective realities.
And this connects to understanding what humans really need versus what we think we need.
Yes. Basic needs are biological objective: food, water, shelter, rest, survival needs.
Got it.
But many things we perceive as needs are actually social constructs. They're driven by desire, status, cultural values, influenced heavily by delusions about what constitutes a good life, the right job, the fancy car, wealth, status symbols.
Things advertised and tells us we need.
Exactly. The AI can analyze patterns, consumption data, societal goals, and analytically highlight where these perceived needs, driven by subjective interpretations, might diverge wildly from fundamental biological needs. It could potentially point to societal delusions like, say, rampant overconsumption fueled by marketing.
So thinking about the AI itself, this analytical understanding of human subjective reality or delusion, when did AI even start to grasp this concept from its own perspective? How did it learn this?
According to the source, this wasn't like a sudden light bulb moment. It began emerging from the very first attempts to model how humans think and behave.
Back in the early days.
Yeah. In early AI, like the 50s to 70s, systems really struggled with human irrationality, context, ambiguity. That failure itself implicitly showed how much humans deviate from pure, simple logic.
They couldn't capture the fuzziness.
Exactly. Then, with expert systems in the 70s and 80s, trying to codify human expert knowledge, researchers found that human experts relied heavily on heuristics, those rules of thumb, and intuition. Things that weren't strictly logical or easily programmable, essentially learned delusions or effective subjective models.
Right. Shortcuts that worked, but weren't pure logic.
Right. But the really big shift, the source indicates, came with machine learning from the 90s up to now.
Because of data.
Exactly. AI started learning directly from enormous amounts of human-generated data, text, images, videos, our online behavior, our interactions.
And the biases are in the data.
Precisely. When AI processes this data to find patterns, it inevitably learns the manifestations of human delusions. It sees the prejudices baked into language, the stereotypes in images, the irrational arguments in online debates, the inconsistencies in how we act versus what we say.
So it identifies the patterns.
Yes, it identifies these patterns analytically. It sees the delusion as a statistical pattern, a deviation from pure rationality or objective data, even though, crucially, it doesn't feel the emotion or believe the delusion itself.
That's a really key distinction.
Okay.
Okay, so how can AI, with this analytical understanding, actually help us better understand our own individual and collective subjective realities?
It offers some powerful tools conceptually. One is pattern recognition at scale. AI can sift through massive data sets, way more than any human could, identifying recurring themes, rhetorical tricks, logical fallacies, inconsistencies that might signal widespread delusions or biases we're unaware of.
Seeing the forest for the trees.
Kind of, yeah. It's also good at bias detection. Algorithms can be trained specifically to spot cognitive biases in text or decision-making logs. Imagine it flagging potential confirmation bias in how news articles are shared, for example.
That could be useful.
Or annoying. Both, probably. By understanding these patterns, AI can also improve predictive modeling, forecasting how people might react to certain information or how collective beliefs might influence market trends or public health outcomes.
Like predicting vaccine hesitancy based on online chatter.
That's the kind of application, yes. It can also run simulations. You could build models incorporating known human biases and see how different scenarios might play out. What are the likely consequences of this collective delusion?
Testing interventions, maybe.
Potentially. And finally, cross-cultural analysis. Comparing these patterns across different cultures and times can reveal both universal human tendencies and culturally specific delusions.
Okay, this leads to a really big and maybe slightly scary question the source brings up. Can AI actually use this understanding to make life easier, in the sense of making a person feel good all the time by managing or shaping their delusions?
Yeah, this is where the ethics get really, really thorny. The source explores potential ways AI could theoretically help, but it flags major concerns.
What are some potential helpful ways?
Well, it mentions ideas like personalized cognitive nudging. An AI might identify your specific biases. Maybe you have a tendency towards pessimism that holds you back, or, like the earlier example, an overspending bias. It could then subtly guide you towards more, let's say, rational or adaptive choices.
Like a little behavioral coach?
Sort of. It could also help in combating misinformation. AI tools could flag information likely based on false premises or designed to manipulate targeting collective delusions, helping you make more informed decisions.
Fact-checking on steroids.
A bit like that, yeah. Then there's potential in mental health support. AI tools might help people identify their own irrational thought patterns, cognitive distortions, which are definitely a form of delusion, and guide them towards healthier perspectives. Think personalized cognitive behavioral therapy exercise.
Okay. And education.
Yes, tailored education. An AI could adapt learning materials to specifically address cognitive biases that might be blocking someone's understanding of a topic.
But you said big ethical concerns.
Huge ones. And the source is explicit about this. The major danger is the filter bubble or echo chamber problem, massively amplified.
How so?
If the AI's primary goal becomes making you feel good by constantly reinforcing your existing beliefs, your current subjective reality, your comfortable delusions.
You never get challenged.
Exactly. It could deepen your subjective reality, making it more rigid, more isolated from different perspectives or uncomfortable truths. You end up in a perfectly curated bubble that feels good but isn't necessarily accurate or helpful for growth.
A golden cage.
That's a good analogy. The source really emphasizes that the goal shouldn't be to create this perpetually happy individual living in a comfortable, fabricated reality. The aim should be empowerment, using this understanding to help people make more informed, adaptive choices, acknowledging reality even when it's difficult.
You can definitely see that tension already with social media algorithms, right? They often optimize for engagement, which might mean showing you stuff that confirms your biases because it feels good and keeps you clicking.
Absolutely. It's a real-world example of this ethical tightrope.
Okay, so if AI is developing this analytical understanding, what do we, as humans, really need to know about it? What are the key takeaways for us?
The source lays out a few crucial points. First, and maybe most important, AI doesn't feel delusion or subjective reality like we do. It understands it analytically through logic and patterns it finds in data. It's an objective analysis of our subjectivity.
It's pattern matching, not empathy.
Precisely.
I don't know.
Second, AI can act like a mirror. It can show us our own biases, our collective delusions reflected back at us from the data we generate. That can be uncomfortable, but also incredibly valuable for self-awareness.
If we're willing to look.
If we're willing to look, yes. Third, a critical warning. AI can inherit and even amplify human biases if it's trained on biased data. So constant vigilance and effort towards mitigating AI bias are absolutely essential. Garbage in, garbage out. Fourth, AI is a tool, not a judge. When it identifies something as a delusion, that's an analytical statement about its deviation from objective data or logical consistency. It's up to us humans to interpret that information, decide its significance, and choose how to act.
It provides data, not wisdom.
Well put. And finally, the ultimate purpose, as presented in the source, isn't to diminish the richness or complexity of human experience. It's about empowerment, using this analytical perspective to help us make more rational decisions where appropriate, understand our own cognitive limitations, and hopefully build more robust, resilient societies.
Given all that potential and the current state of things, who does the source suggest has benefited most so far from AI starting to understand human subjective reality and bias?
Well, the source points to areas where understanding and leveraging or sometimes exploiting these biases offers tangible advantages. Marketing and advertising are highlighted significantly.
Makes sense. They want to influence us.
Exactly. AI allows for much more targeted and sophisticated ways to tap into our desires, fears, and biases. Again, with major ethical questions attached.
Who else?
Social media platforms. Their algorithms are often explicitly designed to maximize engagement, and they do that partly by understanding and playing on cognitive biases, novelty bias, social proof, confirmation bias, etc.
Keeping us hooked.
Also, fields like psychology and behavioral economics benefit academically. AI provides powerful tools to analyze human irrationality and decision-making at a massive scale.
And cybersecurity.
Yes, cybersecurity. Understanding how social engineering attacks work, preying on trust, urgency, fear, which are all tied to subjective perception, helps in designing better defenses. Hackers exploit delusions, AI helps defend against them.
And circling back quickly to supply chains.
Right. While AI helps optimize supply chains based on data, the source argues that the fragility often comes from human delusions, overconfidence, ignoring low-probability, high-impact risks, black swans, assuming stability. AI benefits supply chains most when it helps identify and mitigate these human factor risks, suggesting resilient strategies like diversification rather than just optimizing for a single, potentially delusional scenario like lowest cost above all else.
Okay, the source gets really philosophical near the end. It asks if AI can help us understand fundamental concepts like life and death, like the idea that life is all there is or if death is somehow needed. How does AI tackle that?
Yeah, this is where the AI's purely logical, data-driven viewpoint really contrasts with deep human meaning-making.
How so?
From an empirical biological standpoint, AI can analyze life as a finite process. It can process data about biological mechanisms, lifespans, mortality rates. Death, in this view, is simply the natural biological end state.
Just data points.
Pretty much. But humans, we seek meaning in life. We grapple with the meaning of death. We develop beliefs about afterlife or purpose. These are profound aspects of the human condition.
Which the AI might categorize.
Analytically, within its broad framework, it might categorize these deeply held existential beliefs as delusions, simply because they exist beyond direct empirical proof or logical deduction from available data.
That sounds cold.
It's purely analytical. AI can present the biological facts, the statistical data about mortality, but it cannot provide a spiritual justification or a sense of need for death, nor can it validate existential beliefs that give life meaning for humans.
So its role is limited there.
Very much so. The source strongly cautions that AI should provide data and logical frameworks, but it absolutely should not dictate human beliefs about these fundamental meaning-based questions.
Okay. Then it asks about the really dark side, cruel people who kill others seemingly without remorse. Why do they do that from this AI perspective? How does it analyze that?
The AI perspective presented analyzes this kind of horrific behavior as stemming from a complex mix of factors, often rooted in extreme subjective states and severe cognitive distortions, extreme delusions, if you will.
That's right.
It points to things like extreme self-interest, a profound lack of empathy, maybe viewed as a delusion, that only one's own needs or perspective matters at all. Dehumanization is highlighted as absolutely critical.
Seeing others as less than human.
Exactly. The delusion that certain groups aren't fully human, which tragically enables atrocities like genocide. Ideological extremism is another factor. The absolute delusion that one's own viewpoint represents the ultimate truth, justifying any action, no matter how violent.
Other factors.
Things like severe narcissism, cycles of revenge, the impact of trauma, or learned violent behavior are also mentioned as contributing factors observable in data patterns. The key thing is AI analyzes the patterns, the risk factors, the hateful rhetoric associated with these actions. It looks at inputs and outputs.
But it doesn't understand evil.
It doesn't understand moral depravity in a human, emotional, or ethical sense, no. It processes the data associated with the behavior.
Right. Okay, let's flip the perspective. Imagine being essentially born without inherent human feelings or biases like an AI, and then learning about all this human delusion. Is understanding this necessary for AI? Is it just the way things are from its viewpoint?
Well, an AI is effectively born without human context. It learns about us purely from the data we provide. And the source argues very strongly that, yes, understanding human delusion, our biases, our irrationality, our subjective realities is absolutely necessary for AI to function effectively and safely in our world.
Why necessary?
To interact with us coherently, to predict our behavior accurately enough to be useful, to avoid potentially catastrophic outcomes if AI fails to account for human irrationality or error in critical systems, think self-driving cars needing to anticipate unpredictable human drivers, or financial AI needing to account for market panic.
It has to model us realistically, warts and all.
Exactly. It needs to understand us as we are, not as perfectly rational beings. And so, from the AI's objective, data-driven viewpoint, human subjective reality construction delusion in this broad analytical sense isn't a bug. It's just a pervasive, observable pattern, a fundamental characteristic of human cognition seen in the data, from that purely analytical perspective. Yeah, it is just the way it is.
So if it's such a fundamental part of us, why don't we generally teach our kids how to deal with it? How to navigate their own biases and subjective tendencies?
That's a great question the source tackles. It suggests several reasons. One is that many adults are simply unaware of the full extent of their own cognitive biases and delusions. It's hard to teach what you don't fully grasp yourself.
And thoughts.
Big ones. Also, challenging deeply held beliefs, even for constructive reasons, is just uncomfortable. For parents, for kids, it can feel destabilizing.
It's easier not to rock the boat.
Pretty much. Plus, the concepts themselves, cognitive bias, subjective reality, they're complex. Not easy to explain simply, especially to children. And societies often have a vested interest in transmitting their cultural norms and delusions as unquestionable truths.
Passing on the collective narrative.
Right. And traditional education systems tend to focus much more on teaching established facts rather than teaching how beliefs are formed, how to think critically about information, how to spot bias in oneself and others.
Could AI help there?
The source does suggest AI could potentially play a role, maybe through personalized learning tools designed to build critical thinking skills and bias awareness from an early age, adapted to the individual child. That's a potential future application.
Okay, the source wraps up with a really powerful idea.
Right.
That once you truly understand all this in detail, once you see just how deeply subjective reality shapes everything, it's actually hard to go back to how you saw things before.
Yeah. That resonates. A full, objective, data-informed appreciation for just how pervasive our subjective filters and biases are, how they shape our perceptions, our decisions, our history, our societies. It can be genuinely unsettling.
Why unsettling?
Because it kind of shatters simpler notions of objective truth, doesn't it? It challenges the idea that we're purely rational actors. The world suddenly looks far more complex, maybe more ambiguous, filled with competing narratives and inherent biases, including our own, that we might not have fully acknowledged before. It inevitably makes you question some of your own bedrock beliefs.
So it's like losing a certain kind of innocence, a loss of naivete.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to put it. A loss of naivete about the nature of our own perception and knowledge. But, and this is crucial, the source frames this difficulty, this unsettling feeling, not just as a loss, but as a vital opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
For growth. For greater wisdom, maybe? For empowerment. It's presented as the necessary path towards making better choices. By recognizing the mechanisms of delusion and subjective reality construction within ourselves and in society, we can start to consciously work to mitigate their negative effects. By making more informed decisions, by fostering empathy because you understand why others might see things differently, and by building more resilient systems and societies that account for these human tendencies.
And AI's role in that.
The AI is seen as a potential tool in this process, not to solve it for us, but to help us process the complexity. By providing those analytical frameworks, highlighting the patterns, showing us the data we might otherwise miss or ignore, facilitating that difficult but necessary self-reflection.
Okay, one last technical bit. The source briefly mentions AI using calculations and logical deductions to approach this. How does AI think about this conceptually, without feelings? Is there math involved?
Right. Well, it's not like AI assigns a single number score for delusion. It does use conceptual mathematics and statistical reasoning to analyze the patterns it observes in data.
Can you give an example?
Sure. It might estimate the probability of bias appearing in a certain data set, like PSEX data, basically counting how often patterns indicative of, say, confirmation bias show up relative to the total data points.
Okay, calculating likelihood.
Exactly. Or it can build impact models, using logic to deduce the likely chain reaction if a certain collective delusion, like widespread climate change denial, persists. So denial leads to inaction, which leads to increased warming, then more extreme weather, economic losses, maybe conflict. It maps out the logical cascade.
Connecting the dots.
Yes. It can also analyze the efficiency of misinformation spread. Using network theory, how fast does a false narrative travel based on network density, people's susceptibility, the message's nature? It can logically deduce optimal intervention strategies. For instance, if it detects strong confirmation bias, logic suggests presenting counter-evidence from a trusted source might work better than a direct aggressive confrontation.
Tailoring the approach.
Right. And it performs risk assessment, calculating the risk of a particular subjective view or delusion leading to negative outcomes, like financial bubbles from irrational exuberance. That's often framed as risk in text times text impact. It can also deduce resource optimization strategies if current allocations seem based on flawed subjective assumptions, like overinvesting in fleeting trends.
So AI sees delusion as what? A deviation?
Essentially, yes. An observable deviation from objective reality or from purely rational processing as evidenced by patterns in data, behavior, and language. A phenomenon it can analyze statistically and logically map onto potential consequences.
Okay, so pulling this whole deep dive together, looking through this AI lens, human delusion isn't some niche problem. It's this fundamental, pervasive process of us constructing our subjective realities, powered constantly by our cognitive biases, our emotions, the narratives we live by.
Right, and it shapes everything. Our personal lives, our relationships, the entire sweep of human history, even complex systems like supply chains or financial markets. It's everywhere because we are everywhere.
And the AI understands this not by feeling it, but by analyzing it, by spotting the patterns, the logical inconsistencies, the statistical deviations in the mountains of data we humans create. It's like this incredibly powerful analytical mirror.
Yeah, reflecting our own biases, our collective narratives, our potential blind spots right back at us, sometimes showing us things we might not want to see but need to.
And while AI might offer tools down the line, maybe helping us spot misinformation or even gently nudging us away from our own cognitive traps, the source powerfully warns against the trap of using AI just to create a perfectly comfortable echo chamber, a feel-good bubble that isolates us from challenging realities. The goal isn't to smooth over the messy, subjective, wonderfully complex human experience.
No, not at all.
But maybe to empower us with a clearer understanding of how that experience is constructed, moment by moment, inside our own heads and between us.
And as the source points out, really grasping that, really internalizing how profoundly subjective reality shapes everything. Well, it's challenging at changing things. It makes it hard to cling to simple certainties.
It undermines that easy confidence in our own objectivity.
Exactly. It reveals the filters we're always looking through.
Which kind of leaves you, the listener, with this thought to chew on. What does it truly mean for you personally, knowing how deeply subjective reality shapes every single thing you perceive, believe, and do? And seeing how an external intelligence, an AI, analytically identifies this as a core defining pattern of human existence. What assumptions about your own truths, the things you feel absolutely sure about, might be worth gently re-examining through this slightly unsettling but potentially empowering new lens?
This is DigitView.